the case. But as I'm sure you're well aware, the world of sociology is getting more competitive, and that when you go on the job market, if you want to get a good job, both an academic job and increasingly non-academic job, it really helps to have one or more publications. And this is something we've tried to accommodate in the graduate program. So for example, we used to have 2 separate prelim exams, now we have 1, so you devote more time to publication. We used to require an MA thesis, now it's just the research paper. And the research paper, among other things, is a paper that you either have to present or publish, and so we try and push you toward publication. But another thing we're doing is holding this session to provide some concrete advice about how to best go about getting published. And we're very fortunate in our presenters. We have, among others, 2 editors, or I guess ex-editors of former editors of leading sociology journals, the major sociology journal in social psychology and in sociology of culture, and then 2 graduate students who've had much success at publishing. And I might mention that there are a lot of graduate students from which I could have selected, because I think most or a significant minority of our students do publish, and many get several publications, but I selected just 2 that I haven't asked to do anything in these sorts of venues before. But there are many others that are out there of success in publishing, and I'm sure would be happy to pass on advice as well. But we're going to get started. I'm going to ask Tim to present first, followed by Karen, and then we'll go through the graduate student presentations. And at the end of the presentations, we'll open it up for questions. And so, Tim, thanks for agreeing to be here.
All right, well, I am going to go old school and hand out a piece of paper. Take one and pass it around, please. So why am I here? So as Bob mentioned, I was formerly the editor of Poetics, which is the leading cultural sociology journal, not just in the U.S., but around the world. I was editor for 5 years, so I've seen hundreds and hundreds of submissions. I've also, if it's coming around, I've also been on the board for several journals, including American Sociological Review, currently on the board for Sociological Forum. So as a result, you see lots of reviewing as well. So from the vantage point that I've had, and I want to give you lists and suggestions of things. So I've been asked in the past about publishing, and I've actually formulated this list for previous. Here you go.
You wanted to be inconspicuous.
I've given this to other groups too, because as I was editing, I noticed that with a number of submissions, there were things that were going on that were common, and so I noticed what common things proved disadvantageous for people who were submitting, and I also noticed common but less frequent things that actually were among those who were successful at the publishing process. So I've broken it down into 4 general areas. I'm not going to talk about the review process itself in great detail because Karen will be talking about that. But let's just start off with the general points. And as an editor, I was amazed at the extent to which. So every submission that we have, I'm going to backtrack. Every submission that we had at Poetics, we'd have 3 reviewers. And they would have several months to read the paper submission, write a review, and then send it to the editors. And the editors look it over and decide if they're going, what's the paper get rejected, revise and resubmit, acceptance, etc. And I was amazed at the extent to which reviewers were very supportive, very thoughtful in their comments. You hear horror stories about reviewers who are mean and things of that nature. We rarely encounter that at Poetics. We occasionally had some reviewers who were brusque, and who, but at the same time they would come down a little hard. But then after they came down hard, they would give suggestions as to how to correct what they pointed out. And so, brusqueness aside, they were actually very helpful. And so the first thing I want you to know, though, then, is to realize that you're part of a scholarly community. So your research doesn't stand alone for it to get published. There are other people who you don't necessarily know. Sometimes you do know them after the fact. who are taking seriously your work. And you would think that maybe the best reviews come from young people and that established superstars don't have the time of day. It's not the case. I didn't see any clear demarcation of who wrote the longest or things of that nature. That being said, remember that the academic world has very high standards. So at most journals, the mode is for to reject. So most submissions are going to get rejected. Right? And you can see that on the acceptance rates that various journals publish. The other thing that's for general points is that the scholarly community on one hand is very small and intimate. On the other hand, it's very global and widespread. And I mention this because if you give a conference presentation and someone is in the audience and they ask some questions and make some comments about your paper and say, you know, this is what you could do to improve this paper. Here's some things that I've noticed that are problematic. If you just go, oh yeah, thank you, and then send the paper off for review, I've seen in the past that the person who's given comments that the author ignored was the person who was reviewing. And you don't have a... Part of the review process is that the extent to which, how much do you believe or trust that the author can address your comments? That's part of the decision process. And it doesn't help the reviewer when they think, I've already told this person this, and they didn't incorporate my comments. I'm not confident that they're going to incorporate them into the revision process.
Can I add a corollary?
Yeah.
So if you have a paper you submitted at Journal X and they reject it, and you submit it to Journal
yeah.
Y, you're often likely to get some of the same reviewers. And the number of times I've had reviewers say, I reviewed this for X, it doesn't really look like they changed it much.
Yeah.
That is the death knell.
Yeah. I actually, as editor, I got submissions that I was a reviewer at another journal for. And yes, so I could see that they didn't incorporate any of my reviews after I spent, 5 pages of offering detailed comments. Then it comes to me and it's, no, they're not going to put the work in. So it's smaller than you think, but also the scholarly community is bigger. So there's a tendency to want to be insular and focus on your area. But if you're dealing with a topic such as health, don't assume that you only need to know this part of sociology of health. You may need to know other parts of health that are outside of sociology as well, or in multiple areas of sociology. And you may need to know research that's relevant that's not done in the U.S. So be mindful of the fact that your insular area can be a disadvantage if you're not reading widely, because the reviewers oftentimes are selected from a variety of positions. Generalists, specialists, or specialists who are in an area that's not quite the same as you are. So getting ready for submission, this is something I've noticed. Journal articles are not like mystery novels. We need to know where you're going. We don't want to be surprised at the end. Right? And in fact, if you read most sociology articles, it goes something like this. This is what I'm doing. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm doing. This is what I did. You know, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm doing. This is what I did. And so you're constantly being given roadmaps for the piece. And so if, as a result, be mindful of that. You also have to be able to summarize your article in a few bullet points, which is what an abstract is. Right? So if your article is not, your submission is not coherent enough to do that, you have some problems. Also, this is a common issue. If you have this big theory section, and then you have your methods and your findings, and your theory section is this gigantic, and then your empirics are only focused on this part of the theory section, that's a problem. There should be some sort of match. Or if all of your findings have nothing to do with what you've said in the literature review, that's a problem as well. Now, there are theory papers and there are methods papers, so I'm talking about the standard one. It's a little bit different for those. But think about the balance. Also, some people try to, if there's you have a regression table or you have a qualitative findings, and in either one, you have things that are coming up that don't match the arguments that you make. I've seen people try to, I'm just going to put that in a footnote, all right? if you have findings that don't resonate with what your argument is, you can't just hide those. You have to deal with them, right? So if someone was doing strain theory and they found, so it's like, there is no effective strain in the entire nation of the Netherlands, and that would put it in the footnote. Bob would say, "Hey, tell me more about that." And also, when you're writing, make sure don't write for the insider, write for the outsider. That's another problem of being too insular, is that you think everyone knows what you're talking about. Oftentimes they don't. So write as if they know nothing about your topic and you're educating them. Dealing with submissions real quickly. Whatever your topic is, you'll probably notice that there's certain journals that deal in that topic more than other journals. That's a good sign for that journalist, one you should submit to. Another thing, we saw this, is that sometimes people would submit to our journal on a given topic that our journal was actually the leading journal of, and there weren't any citations for pieces from our journal in there. So someone just said, "Oh, I'll just send it here." It was the impression that we got. And it's like, well, you have to engage in dialogue with what's come before in this journal, so be mindful of that. I don't know if you realize it, but there are things called impact scores which help rank journals. So if time allows, in your area, go for a really high journal. And if you're in a rush, you can go for the second tier. So there's this balancing going on between first tier and second tier journals, generalist journals and specialist journals. So think about that as you're moving along. The other thing is that Karen will be talking more about the reviews, but many journals will ask you to recommend a reviewer. That's part of yours, yeah, it was. Do not name people that you know. I mean, don't name faculty from Emory, because Emory faculty should not be reviewing you for a publication while you're at Emory. Don't put your dissertation advisor as well. A lot of times we know these connections as the editors, but sometimes we don't. And it gets really irritating when you find out, well, this person's it looks like you're trying to stack the deck. You see what I mean? That you're trying to sneak something through. That may not be what you want, but that's what it looks like. So as a result, don't name Emory people. Now, sometimes you'll have people that you know slightly, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people that you're tight with. They should not be your reviewers.
Exclude your best friends from graduate school.
Right. As far as the review process, it takes about, we gave a month for reviewers. How long did you?
I think what we do is we say that in 3 weeks, then we send out a reminder in 3 weeks and say 1 more week.
Most reviews are late, but also there's the process of getting reviews. So whenever a submission comes in, we would have to contact all these people, and some people are already reviewing for you, so you can't go to them. So it takes a while to get the reviewers, and then the reviewers takes them a while to do their work, and then when the reviews come in, the editors have to reread the paper. They've already read it to invite people for review, but they reread the paper, read the reviews, and then make a decision. So as a result, if you send a submission in and then contact the editor 2 weeks afterward and says, "Is it ready?" it's not going to win you any favors, all right? So most journals will say how long it takes, so look at that. 3 months is pretty typical. After 3 months, it's all right to start asking, especially if it's 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. Feel free to inquire. Moving quickly, dealing with reviews, rejection is the mode, so when you get an R&R, that's a reason to celebrate. Right? So the first time I heard someone say, "I got an R&R, I'm so happy," I was confused because I thought, well, you didn't get published. Now that's how you get published, is the R&R, so feel happy about that. With the reviewers, when you see their comments, if you think, well, they don't know what I'm doing, well, maybe you didn't make clear what you were doing. And if they're misunderstanding, they can help you formulate your argument. Framing is often a major focus of pieces, not the intricacies and nitty-gritty of the article, but instead how do you put this all together? And the review process, is, in my experience, is very important in that regard. They give good advice, so be open to what they have to say. Also, sometimes reviewers just don't agree with each other. They can disagree markedly. And that's the editor's job to step in and say, you know, you have these contradictory things. Here's what I ask of you to do, right? And so as a result, some editors are very explicit. So I would say, I really want you to do a reviewer 2 suggest. I think that's the way to go. But be mindful of reviewer 1. If you can address it, that's good as well. And then finally, if you get a reject, that's also, I like to encourage people to think of that as revise and resubmit. So you get a rejection at one journal, it helps you think about how can I improve this? What can I do better with this paper? And then you improve the paper before you send it on to another journal. And be mindful, you may get the same reviewers at the other journal. And if you just said, reject here, send it out here, as Karen said, it can backfire. So those are, I'm rushing through, but I wanted to give you the handout, and we can talk more about various things afterwards.
Thanks, Tim, for great advice. And Karen, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
And again, we'll hold questions toward the end.
And what I'm doing is I'm going to have you do role taking. As you all know, I'm a social psychologist. So instead of telling you what to do, I'm going to tell you what the reviewers do. And so if you think like a reviewer, you may be able to nip some things in the bud before they get too bad, so to speak. Tim, and can you send me over here?
Yes.
Here you go, Ryan. Oh, can I have one of those, please?
Yes.
And actually, Ryan, I think you're the wrong pile. Give it back. I'm sorry. It'll come around to you. 'Cause I brought 15 copies. They're not enough.
Well, that's good.
You got one. Are you short one?
Yeah, for sure. It's
I'll make some more
No,
copies
wait a
and I'll
minute,
put them on the
that's the wrong
bulletin board in the
thing.
Grant Lounge as well. So maybe if you can share for now.
Okay, what I brought was 2 things. One is the journal reviewing guidelines, and the second, and that's what started to go around, and I'm just going to give you an example of a review I wrote. And I did this instead of taking one out of SBQ, because one of the wonderful things in the SBQ system was we could rate reviewers. If I still had access to that system, I could find some that I gave 3s to and some that I gave 1s to. Most modal was a 2 rating on quality. A 3 means, wow, you've gone above and beyond. A 1 means, I'm never going back to you again. And a 2 was modal. But we discovered that there was variation in what our reviewers did in terms of the content of their reviews. So a few years into our term as editor, we reinvented the wheel. Actually, what we did was we went to all these sources. It's like Gender and Society had reviewer guidelines, and I think SBQ had reviewer guidelines 10 years ago. And so we looked at those and thought, okay, let's cull from these. Great, basically a simple handout. There's something currently on the SBQ website that's been a revision of this by the new editors, but I gave you the one that I wrote that Dina contributed to as well. So as Tim has already said, when a manuscript comes in, it's the editor's task to look for reviewers. And that can be a major task sometimes. With SBQ, we had to make sure if it's more psychologically oriented, we would get a psychologist, but we wanted to make sure because most of our readers are sociologists. We also make sociological input. We look at references, we look at the manuscript, we think about people in the area that we know or that we have used before. Some of the systems allow you to search on keywords to find out reviewers that you've used before. And it will take to get 3 reviewers, sometimes 12. Occasionally, we went to 24 people to invite them to review for us. But our goal was always to get 3. Sometimes we wouldn't have the 3rd one in time, and if the other 2 rejected it, we went with 2 reviewers. It was just for expedience sake. So editors work in different ways. But what do we tell the reviewers to look for? And this is the first topic here. And as Tim has already said, is what's the contribution of the paper? As he has said, your front end, your methods and results, and your back end need to fit together. I always think of it as a story that is unfolding, and what's the string that pulls it all together. So reviewers should look for that. And that's how carefully the argument is crafted, how the literatures that are being drawn upon, not just your narrow piece, as Tim has already said, but the broader literature as well. Don't go too broad though, you have to find that happy medium. As somebody told me when I was a new assistant professor, it's all about the packaging. And you've got to figure out what package is most appropriate for the journal and the audience that you are targeting. But so the contribution of the paper needs to stand out, the argument needs to be cogent. You want to, reviewers are going to look at the methods. Are they appropriate? So if you have this big elaborate argument and you have this tiny little experiment, and your argument is about time and place, and you do this little experiment, you're going to, no, this doesn't really work. There's got to be some good survey data here out there that might better fit the argument that's in front of the paper. We will also look at the data analytics strategies. The number of papers I have seen thinking, why did they just use ANOVA? They should be using regression, or vice versa. Some social psychologists would do like ANOVA under some circumstances. Are they transforming their variables in a really odd way so you become skeptical of the results? And that goes to what the authors claim they found out. If it's a cogent argument, set of methods, and analysis, you can be fairly certain that what they're claiming they found out is what you would find out if you did the same thing. Sometimes you're skeptical about that, so that's worthy of comment. Was it Jim, blanking on his name, he's at Georgia State and he does educate, Jim Ainsworth, who I'd get there. He gave a presentation in our department a number of years ago, and he talked about writing papers, he talked about no stone unturned. And so you don't want to put in footnotes, or reviewers aren't going to be happy if you put in footnotes main findings, like in the strain paper, and the example that Tim already gave. But they may have, well, what if you did this? And that might be worthy of a footnote. And it's demonstrating that you've really looked at your data thoroughly, you're fairly well convinced that what you found is what you should have found. And the fifth thing here is, once somebody reads the entire paper, they are looking for that compelling storyline. Are the parts well integrated? Do I have concise analysis? Do I walk away knowing something that I didn't know before that will move the literature forward? That's really what you want to convince the reviewer of, that your paper makes that major contribution. And it fits with your intended guidelines for the journal. And the number of submissions that we've gotten, we may have had this too, like, why are they sending this to us?
Yeah.
You know, like, we got some papers on revolution. Kind of interesting, but they didn't belong in a social psychology journal.
We got poetry.
I've heard that.
I love that story.
Gender and Society once got submitted a poem as well. So, you know, there are different outlets. Know your outlet and whether or not your work is appropriate for it. But so the reviewers are going to look for all these things. So if you think like a reviewer, you will begin to put your paper together like a reviewer. So what does a reviewer do? Typically they start with the abstract. As Tim has already said, that abstract is key because, and if you think like a social psychologist and think about, you know, how the abstract sets up the schemes that you use to read the rest of the paper, that abstract is important. So the abstract needs to fit what you put in your paper. Don't introduce a word in the abstract that's never defined in the paper. Reviewers don't like that. When you go to write your review, you start the review with a brief statement of what the paper is about and a summary of the manuscript strengths. As I said, this is just a review I wrote for Social Justice Research. I wrote it a couple of years ago. I doubt any of you will have ever read this journal, or few of you will have looked at articles in this journal. Some of you I know will have because you've taken my classes. But the editor that I submitted to liked it, so I thought I got a 3 on it. So that's why I'm sharing it with you, and because it's my writing, I can share it with you without violating anybody's anonymity or copyright. But you'll see what I do is I structure it. I look at, you know, an opening paragraph says, yes, I've read it, I understand it, and here's some good things about it. But it gives me pause in certain ways. And then, as a reviewer, I go through and I critique it, but I critique it in a way that is constructive, and I cannot voice that enough. So when you get reviews and you're sorting through your reviews on your own work, Some of them that are very harsh, and that does happen occasionally, you want to discount those. They may have good substance though, and so you really have to look beyond the tone. But if you're acting as a reviewer, I would expect you to give critically constructive information. The reviewer is going to identify the big picture and the main issues. Some reviewers go page by page. I don't see that as very helpful to the, it's helpful nitpicky stuff, but it's not helpful in the larger pulling it together. What is it that I need to do to revise the paper? Because as Tim already said, even if you get rejected, it's a revise and resubmit somewhere else. So you can go on from there. Other smaller things, you need to comment on smaller issues if they compromise the meaning of what the author's trying to convey. Everybody has their own nitpicky things about writing, and I'm very guilty of that. But you don't have to put that in a review, because most manuscripts go under public editing. And I think this is the key thing that I want to emphasize here, and then I'm going to stop so the graduate students can talk. When you are writing a review, think about the type of feedback that you would want to receive from a reviewer of your own work. When you're writing your manuscript, anticipate the types of things that reviewers are likely to say to you and try to correct them before you submit your own work. So if you do it as sort of a role-taking process, you may have more success early on than would otherwise be the case. And then the last thing, very mundane, that I'll mention, is that when you submit, most of the submissions now are via web. Answer all the questions that are given there. Answer them carefully and fully. When they ask you for reviewer possibilities, do what Tim said, but also don't give a dozen, because many editors will not go to the suggested reviewers. At SBQ, if you suggested a dozen, we were angry, because those were people that we would have gone to, and we don't always know the relationships. I do have a funny story to tell. When we got papers from former students, Kathy and I didn't handle them, because that would have been a conflict of interest. So we send them to one of our deputy editors. One of our deputy editors kindly asked Bob Agnew to review the work of one of his former students. He gave him an R&R. I think it was important to tell him what he did. Did you know that?
No.
No. And when Kathy and I saw this, we went, oh my God. 'Cause we thought it was kind of, but she had no idea. So don't put your advisors your best friends. Don't give a long list. Just give a few, 3 or 4, that you really think would be great, whose feedback you would really want to have. You'll never know if you got it, but it helps the editor.
Well, thank you, Karen. And now we go from, I guess, old school to high tech, new school. A joint presentation, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
two of your fellow students have had much success in the publishing world.
When you think Emory graduate students, think team. Go team.
Go Eagles.
Go Eagles.
They got tired when they
All right, so we just have a couple things to say about publishing in graduate school. I'll cover several brief points just for a couple minutes, and I'll hand it over to Natalie. You can see how much experience I have with emails. So when we come to graduate school, we have this underlying suggestion, this underlying idea that everything you write, should eventually could be developed into a publication. And while that goal is laudable, we also have to be realistic. So I'm a very realistic person, and so everything I've written during graduate school, although I haven't focused on each single, say, class paper becoming an article, what I've tried to do is using each type of class paper to contribute in some way to a publication. So, for example, I've taken a human rights course at the same time as I'm taking a world culture, global structures and processes course. And so while these two separate class papers did not become articles. What ultimately did happen through these two class papers is that I utilized a significant portion of this human rights paper, significant portion of the world cultural paper to engage with each other in terms of the hypotheses and theoretical framework that ultimately ended up in publication. And that's also happened with the class in public health on gender and class upstairs on political science, government capacity, state capacity. So what you'd like to think about is, sure, you write a class paper, get it over and done with, but you might want to also think about everything should be contributing ultimately in some way to publication or your dissertation work. And so how does this, how can this outcome be more formally addressed, right? So you write a class paper, of course you utilize this opportunity with your professor, with the class advisor, with the class professor to develop a paper, tell him or her what you ultimately want for the paper. And so for me, I have a very difficult time writing a class term paper within a month in the last couple of weeks. I can't do that. I need to start the process early, engage with the advisor, and ultimately react that way. So what's happening there is you're receiving a lot of feedback. It's almost like a revise and resubmit with the advisor in that format. So by the time you hand in the class paper and receive it back, you will have worked with them for several months. You will also maybe present it in class, receive the feedback of your of your fellow classmates. So already right there, a lot of people are reading it, a lot of people are engaging with your dialogue, and utilize that. That's to your benefit. From there, you should also have learned all the conferences occurring, right, within ASA or regionals. And if you do a particular topic, think outside of like strictly the academic discipline. So some of the stuff I do is on trafficking. So there's a whole another community outside of academia that does trafficking, like criminologists, people just within the mainstream that are very interested in this. And they always are holding conferences. So I've submitted some of my stuff to those type of places. And already you're getting more people reading your work. And although your work might not be published in an academic setting, if it is published in another setting, that's ultimately going to benefit you. So that's another positive thing. So you might want to turn your class paper into a conference paper, right? Any type of conference where you're having more people read it, more people engage with it, and as Tim said, provide you feedback there and make sure you apply that feedback. And from there, you can obviously submit to a journal, right? And there are a lot of things that go into there. You can submit to various academic journals, and you have to be strategic, talk with your advisor, talk about what ultimately you want out of it. Is it going to fit more in this journal, more in that journal? So sometimes some of my work hasn't been strictly sociological, and so I've actually emailed different professors at different universities and said, could you just quickly glance over this? What do you think? Where do you think this fits in best? So Michael Elliott, he was a former student here, and now he teaches in Towson. Yeah, Towson. And he quickly glanced it over, and he said he does a lot of human rights work, and he said this fits perfectly here. So I submitted there, and the process works in that format. You get the you get the journal back, you get the article back, you get a bunch of revisions, take care of this, take care of that, or rejection. You might want to submit somewhere else, and you apply everything in that format, and ultimately, fingers crossed, it's a publication.
I thought that one of the most interesting things about this idea of class papers and where this goes, I think it's the transition in your head from undergraduate work to graduate level on faculty ultimately work, where one of the best ways this was ever explained to me was that fundamental to the endeavor of being a scholar was the creation and dissemination of knowledge. So if you're not creating knowledge that you're ultimately looking to disseminate, then you're not moving along on that career trajectory. Right? So the first step of doing that is seeing your class papers not as an assignment to be completed, but rather as the beginning of attacking a research question. And once you thoroughly attack a research question, that should move to publication, because ultimately we have work product that's associated with our jobs and our careers. I liked that idea also because it set up, yeah, I think I'll do next. I think it sets us up to understand all of the ways that we can move those class papers to publications. Now, you all have class papers that you've done, right? There's a big separation between the shape that they're in and what ultimately a publication looks like. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was co-authorship. I just want to handle that really quickly. Some papers are solo authored, some papers are co-authored. There's good and there's bad. There's like happy days and there's less happy days. And I hope that this speaks to that. So to the good, yay, we have accountability. I love that about working with co-authors. I commit to a deadline to have something. And now because I'm in this partnership, it becomes this responsibility that I have. And you also can marry expertise. Depending on who you're co-authoring with, whether it's your advisor, for example, or whether it's someone that's in your cohort, it can also be really educational. My earliest sort of work, right, is with advisors. And they're like, okay, well, you know that you're gonna have to address this. Having that co-author there meant that we could move that paper forward in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do if I was working with someone who was in my cohort, for example. But there's also less good, right? Who's been in a group project? Yeah. You can have differing expectations, you can have differing deadlines. People have very different ideas of what constitutes busy, I found in my co-authorship, right, career. Like, I mean, I've had prospective co-authors that, you know, we're setting up what our deadlines are, okay? And they'll be like, well, you know, I'm also working on one of their articles, I'm really busy this semester, and I'm like, does that constitute? It's often best to not sort of hitch your horse to that wagon necessarily, and have those conversations in the beginning. The best advice that I got as a first year also was, if you're thinking about a co-authorship relationship, decide who's first author first before you move forward. Who's doing the heavy lifting on this? Because or else you're gonna end up in a really uncomfortable conversation 6 months in which you're like trying to decide who did more work. I think it's really important to know those expectations going in. Okay? To reiterate what Tim said, not all journals are the same in terms of prestige, in terms of what they do for your CV, and in terms of ultimately the reception that your work's going to receive, and ultimately its citations. Okay? It comes back to create and disseminate knowledge. Not all journals will equally disseminate the knowledge that you've created. I use this. There's a lot of websites out there. I happen to use this. Okay. It conflates social and political science, so it won't be as good for you, but I work in political sociology, so it's great for me. And this is just SJR, but it lists the ranking of journals in terms of impact factor. Okay. Now, I think we're all struggling with this, and this conversation comes up in a lot of different contexts. We talk about standardized testing in schools and the degree to which quantitative measures don't speak to the real nuances. But this is a good place to start.
Well, it's actually more inclusive than you're saying, because it's got journal of personality, social psychology listed,
Yeah, because it's within
Sociology.
sociology and political
education,
science.
yeah.
Right, so these are all the poli-sci journals and the social journals put together.
No, but journal of personality, social psychology is a psych journal.
Oh, is it?
That's what I mean, it's more broad than what you're suggesting.
So, this will have your impact factors. It gives me a good place to start in terms of understanding relative sort of impact, right, of journals. I think it's a good sort of first step. This or another website like it, right? And they're really accessible, but you should just know that that's out there. Right? To reiterate what my colleague was saying, your advisors are excellent resources. But that way you don't feel like you're coming to those meetings with no concept of relative prestige. Organization is paramount. Everyone who knows me personally knows I'm crazy like this. I seem like I'm really eccentric. I'm not at all. I'm really organized, but that's how you're able to juggle multiple priorities and juggle multiple tasks at the same time. Okay, this was my Dropbox, like whenever this was, 2 weeks ago. Okay, this is every single thing I'm working on, have worked on, have out, is in R&R, every single thing. Okay, it's all in one place. It's all organized the exact same way. Remember how we started with class papers, move to conference papers, move to revise and resubmit, move to publications. Anything that has a Z is a class paper that I moved to a conference paper, mostly. Right? That then I got reviews back on and they were like, you need completely new data. And then you have to have this conversation with yourself. It's a very difficult conversation with yourself, in which you decide whether that's something that you feasibly can revise, or whether you put a Z in front of it. But I know what's out at any given time. I know what's in R&R status at any given time. I have 2 in R&R right now, actually. Right, but this was a few weeks ago. But I know where everything stands and who I'm working with on anything, right, and where it's supposed to go. If you push next again. I organize all of my publication folders the same exact way. Data, literature, submissions. And then the working paper, which may be a final draft that is submitted someplace. Right? Because until it's published, right, and then there's another one in here with the PDF of the publication. Right? It's a working paper. This is it. Okay? All of the literature that I've read, I have all of the PDFs. Right? So you can find for anything that I've ever worked on, in the same exact manner, everything that you need for that publication. I've seen other people's organizational systems. It's important to have something that works for you, right? But I can't, to my experience, overstate how important it is to have an organizational system that works for you, because or else who knows what's happening. I don't think that we understand, especially in the beginning of our graduate school careers, what Karen and Tim were saying about timing. It takes a long time to get something published. And you have to plan accordingly for when you're anticipating your dissertation will be defended and you're looking beyond the market. Because the expectation when you're on the job market is that you have at least 1, if not multiple publications. Okay. I use January as a starting point because it's the first month. If I have a class paper that's complete in January, I'm not even submitting it to a conference until March, and I'm working on it this whole time. That conference won't be until August. Okay? I'm using the feedback from the conference to ultimately submit that paper to a journal. The modal response is rejection. A good paper will only be rejected once. I then have to submit it to Journal 2. I then have to go through the revise and resubmit process. Then, between acceptance and it coming out, the best that I can hope for is this says 1.75 years in turnaround, right? Between when I have a class paper and when I have a publication, right? It's a long time. It never ceases to amaze me. Things of mine that are coming out now, right, were things that I worked on 1.5 years ago. And that always surprises me. But you have to sort of take that into account and plan accordingly. I think that's all I have. Yeah, what did we miss?
Yeah, we'll open it up for questions. Thank you to all the presenters. Great job. Questions for all the presenters, please.
I would say one thing, is that it gets easier to publish the more you do it. That doesn't necessarily mean every submission that you send is going to be accepted. You still have the rejections, the revise and resubmits, but you just get better at doing it. And the other thing is that, to add to what Natalie was saying at the end, the further along you go, you start to have multiple projects going on. So the timeline for one project can be in its early stage, while the other project is wrapping up. And the further along you get, then the better you are at also balancing that, so you just don't have, research, publication, gap, 5 years publication. You start just things move and flow, and you get really good at being able to balance very complete stuff with stuff that's just getting started.
Yeah, think about the whole process as a learning process. And so your first paper, besides likely to be rejected, unless you're Sabino, it's going to undergo lots of revisions. But you're going to learn how to cope with those revisions, and so you can learn how to better package it. You're going to take that knowledge for the next paper, and then meanwhile you may be developing some of your own reviewing skills, and you're going to say, oh yeah, why didn't this paper do X, Y, and Z? I would have done, I need to do X, Y, and Z on my next project. So, you know, the more you do anything, the better you get.
I used to hear people talk about theory papers versus empirical papers, right, a lot, and people would ask, right, how they would write a theory paper. Just in my experience, and I'm sort of putting this out there, I always have made sure to have data, right, so that everything was empirical. And now I just got an invitation to write a peer-reviewed theory piece. So I'm like, oh, this is how come one would write a theory piece, and they said what they wanted, essentially. So now I'm working on my first theory piece, but I think that it was beneficial to not even think about that until I had that very specific sort of invitation, and just be basing my initial work on empirics and how those looked, I think.
Some of the presenters sort of hinted or stated there's kind of a psychological part to this as well. That you need to be thick-skinned and expect rejection, and it happens to everyone. When I was in graduate school in North Carolina, I was a student associate editor of Social Forces. And the thing that really blew me away when I first started working on it is that some of the leading people in the field would submit articles, people who I respected and had been, you know, really stars, and they would get rejected. And you know, so it happens to everyone, and you know, you grieve, you're depressed for a day or two, but then you need to get over it. And also you need to be brave and willing to take that plunge and sort of, you know, get that paper, and it's not perfect and this and that, but just get it out there, get it under review after a certain point, and stick with it, and don't get discouraged by the rejections, and you'll get that revised and resubmit, and if you keep plugging away, you know, eventually you'll have success.
Yeah, I think that's where your advisor is very important. And so when you're submitting, but also when you get the revised and resubmit, sometimes I don't understand the questions raised or some of the suggestions. And so if I show Dr. Bola, John, he's like, you know, he can explain that to you. But also the other thing is, if you might be very adamant on a certain point. And if Dr. Bola says he agrees with me, then I'm just like, I'm not going to change that. Or I'm very adamant in keeping that there. And if need be, you submit it somewhere else or something. So your advisor is somebody that you should always be leaning upon and engaging with, both like to submit, also for the revising and the resubmitting process as well.
And to that point, I think it's really important when you get reviews back. I remember the first publication that I ever sent out, right, I got a rejection, of course, right, but it comes back with all these reviews, right, so now these are the call to action. But I was so overwhelmed by the reviews, right, so it's 6 pages of, I mean, depending on how you look at life and whether the glass is half full or half empty, 6 pages of helpful suggestions for improving your scholarship, or 6 pages of a text, right? And that also depends on sort of how married you are to that particular paper. But either way, it has to be parsed out. It's overwhelming. Like, how do you deal with that? And lately, for the last year or so, what I've been doing is I put all the reviews in one long paper, right? And I go through, and every sentence or 2 sentences, sometimes it takes 2 sentences to make one point, okay? I put enter, and then I number everything. So it turns into 40 things that have to be addressed. And even if I make the decision to not address them, I have to write underneath number 27, no. But I can't just ignore it, and I can't just be overwhelmed by it. Like, it becomes a list of attainable things, and everything has to be addressed.
Yeah, I was going to say is that I don't know if we made it clear, when you have a revise and resubmit in a journal and then you actually submit the updated paper, you have to write a letter, an explanatory letter. And the letters are very important, and so the letters I appreciate were very much the ones like Natalie said. It's like, okay, some people just do it bit by bit by bit, and other people say, okay, here are the general things, and here's how I've addressed them, here's some specific things. Now, in the course of that letter, if you're adamant about not changing one particular thing, that's where you make your case as to why you're not going to change it. But then when you're adamant about why you're not changing in the letter, it ends up in the submission as well as to why. Because, and in fact, sometimes as an editor I said, your response in the letter was so good, and your response in the paper was not as good. Why don't you take the letter response and put it in the paper? So that's a whole other process. The ones that I don't like, where they say, here's my resubmission,
Oh, yeah,
and you,
we don't allow that,
and they just say, like, I've worked hard to incorporate the
changes, right?
changes, and that just does not go over well. Not with the editors, especially not with the reviewers.
In some ways, you get to be a qualitative sociologist when you get a set of reviews, because you have to do a content analysis of those reviews. So Natalie has one strategy. I would take it down and I would look at my 3 reviews, and, well, this goes here, this goes, these group here. And as an editor, I always liked it when reviewers were hitting on some of the same things, because that's a reliability. And so you do your content analysis. You should, for some journals, look very carefully at the editor's letter, because often the editor will give you signposts. Yeah, this was really a problem, but I think the way reviewer 3 told you to address it isn't going to work. You might want to try. Do what the editor says to do. And with luck, the editor has helped you work through the reviews.
But when you're writing that letter, be very diplomatic, because often the letter will go back along with the revised paper to the original reviewers. So don't say that reviewer X misread the paper and doesn't.
They were
But,
there, yeah.
you know, this was a good point, but I decided to, something along those lines.
And it's in here somewhere too, right? Anything that somebody's misreading is something that you fail to explain. Right? So, I mean, and I honestly like feel like this in my life at this point. Like nobody misreads me. I just need to explain that better.
And Karen, in the papers that you saw, did most people in most of the submissions that you read check all of the boxes that you mentioned, sort of not written like a mystery novel, could be summarized in a few bullet points, and then was it mostly adjudicating based on the content of them? Or did a lot of the submissions that you saw fail to take care of these sort of basic things that you talked to us about?
I don't have a precise number on it, but so if you didn't do those things, you often were among the rejections. Yeah, disorganized papers where you can't make sense of them. The reviewers get frustrated. In fact, some papers that are so disorganized are missing some major things, like a match between theory and empirics. Editors won't even send them out because you don't want to anger the reviewers. You know, like, why are you wasting my time with this? So you should have not even sent this out. So disorganization, lack of coherence, mismatch, those things played a role in the rejections. But sometimes there are well-organized papers that just substantively or analytically don't move things forward enough. That's another way you can get rejected. Or, there are other ways. There are lots of ways to get rejected.
There are far more ways to get rejected than get accepted.
Yeah. But the better organized, the more attentive you are, it makes the reviewers and the editors confident that okay, I think if we, so an R&R, the way I like to look at it is we're saying we're going to invest some more in your time. I'm going to invest my time in you. I have faith, given what I've seen, that this will be a good investment on all of our parts. And when you don't do those things, it's like, I don't want to have my summer working on this because I don't think it doesn't look like it's going to change. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and sometimes the toughest decisions are those that if you could take over the paper and rewrite it, you could make it what it's going to be, but you don't have your summer to invest in this author that you've never met before. And do you want to work with that author?
Mm-hmm.
Because some authors, you read the paper, you know, oh God, there is a kernel of a great idea in here, but it is such a mess. Can I work with this author? And I hate to say it gets down to that. I spent a lot of time working with some authors, and I'm really happy with what came out from them.
Mm-hmm.
Most authors I don't have to spend that much time, but usually if they're young authors, I pause and think, this is a good place to invest my time.
Yeah.
And it's hard sometimes when you get split reviews, like one's really positive, the other rejects it, and then the R&R isn't really what you want to make of it, and you've read the paper and you think, why didn't they say X, Y, and Z? Because you thought X, Y, and Z. And so another problem an editor has is I had this at SBQ because we actually give advice in terms of a revision, is not too much of my own voice. I kept looking for the reviewers to tell me what to do, but occasionally I just had to chime in as well.
Yeah, every now and then there are papers that I know that I just made the call. Because, what I was talking about, a split review. One of the things the editors also know is when it's a split review, sometimes you know why it's a split review.
Because for example, because you've gotten reviewers from different, well, like in social psychology, I might have a psychologist and two sociologists, and the psychologist loves it, but the two sociologists don't.
Yeah. Things of that nature, and also.
There are other.
Yeah, sometimes the gushing positive reviewer is the senior person in the field, and the really critical person is very new. But you don't know that as the author. And the reviewers tend to be good at keeping themselves anonymous, and so the editor has that information. It's like, well, I'm more convinced, not by the prestige, but I know this person, they have a good idea of what the field is, and they see promise for this. I'm willing to go along with their take more than that take.
Editors have more information than the author.
Sort of on that subject, kind of would be great. Can you talk to us a little bit about like who the people are, who we should think of as the reviewers we would recommend if we're prompted? You know, so not people we have tight relationships with, but people who work maybe tangential. Or how did you think about that when you have things?
I cannot at all speak to my success, because I don't know who's ever reviewed my papers. Right? I have absolutely zero strategy for this. Right? I always get the feeling, like this is always this big problem for me, I always hope that they ignore me. Because I feel like the editors know better who needs to review the paper than I do. But I have to answer because they're asking me. So I'm under this pressure in this world where everything's about me. So sometimes, and I would like to tell you that I have method here, but it's arbitrary. Sometimes I pick the biggest names, right, of the most macro thought process behind this paper. Okay? I don't know if any have ever reviewed any of my papers because again, there's no feedback on that side. I don't know who they take and who they don't take. And other times I've picked junior scholars. I think what I'm going to go with moving forward, as I think about it more, is bigger names rather than smaller names, and here's my thinking, okay? I've now reviewed 2 manuscripts. I am really critical.
Mm-hmm.
I am really critical.
Are you constructively critical?
I go back and make sure I'm constructively better. Right? But sometimes I have to go back and make sure and I don't think of myself as a mean person, those of you that know me. Am I a mean person? I'm not a mean person. The process of reviewing teaches me how much I know, and I'm so pleased with myself. So I have to go back and but again, I don't know whose work I'm reviewing.
Yeah.
So it's really a confusing process for me. I think though that what I want from people who are reviewing my paper is less me. Right? So I think I'm going with bigger names from now on. But that's a non-answer. That's everything I got you.
But I want to interject. The editors will think of the big names, and sometimes they want those. Give us some fresh wind.
People you cited in the paper are certainly
Yeah.
prime candidates. I mean, you don't want to select someone you haven't cited. Favorably cited.
And that's stuff from like world culture or world politics. There's like a general group of those types of scholars, and I'll give like 5, 6 names outside everybody not here. And then from there, so
If you presented at a session on that particular topic, some of the panelists might suggest themselves, might seem like they'd be appropriate.
I've actually done that.
Although I guess it's tricky.
I've looked at ASA sessions on particular topics thinking, ooh, is that, and SBQ had a policy to rarely use graduate students as reviewers. Usually we got graduate student reviewers because we've asked their mentor, and the mentor said, I can't do it, but. So then we asked the mentor, are you willing to scaffold it with the student? And most instances, it works out fine. A couple of instances, it was not a good, the graduate student did not write a thorough review at all, just kind of nitpicked on things. I know both Tim and I have given graduate students in the department an opportunity, and their reviews, we've reviewed them with them before they submitted them, just, how about some of this, how about some of that? It's a good thing to learn to do.
Yeah.
And to do well.
Some graduate students are actually experts in their area, and so we would go to those graduate students. I mean, they're the ones that are almost done with their dissertation. And they sometimes they're the cutting edge people, like methodologically, things of that nature. And I found that when we went to those graduate students, they were very careful in their reviews, for the most part.
And once you get publications out there, then you're more likely to be tapped
Yeah.
as a reviewer.
The process of reviewing is really helpful though. Because then it's easier to review your own work, right? As opposed to when you're right at the beginning of your career and you're like, and for me, it's been really
Yeah.
So I have a few questions. Hopefully I'll be able to email you the rest, but there's one that's always been like the boogeyman in my mind, which is you submit a paper and maybe it gets rejected or revised resubmit, but they don't like your method choice or like your style, and they ask you to do something that you perhaps don't know how to do, like for instance ANOVA. Like if I do regression, and they're like, I think something else would have been better or something, and you're like, or like a different data set or something, you're like, well, I mean, that's like sort of keeps me up at night, like if I send that in, it's something bad back like that. How do you typically suggest people deal with changing
I don't recall
methods?
ever really suggesting people to do different data sets, as for R&R. But if you're, didn't Kathy, Kathy Johnson ASR article,
Yes.
she had to do
Yeah.
hierarchical
Linear modeling. or
linear
something like
modeling, and so she didn't know how to do it, if I recall correctly, and didn't work. She worked with Alex and she learned how to do it.
that. You learn.
You learn.
Yeah,
But there are
we have
people around who
QTM,
can help.
And
Yeah.
QTM will walk you through that, they have a whole
Yeah.
help desk
QTM
for
is
QTM.
now in existence.
Yeah.
Before that,
Right.
you went to your
But
college,
for-
which is part
So
of
I guess
the-
specifically, it's like, what if you do a method and then you try another method that just, and like your results disappear? Like, is that, I mean,
That's
That's one of the reasons maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and sometimes I've seen papers where I'm thinking, why didn't they put this variable in? Clearly, they're using this data set, they have that variable. Why is that variable not there as a control? Probably because when they put it in, everything disappeared.
Yeah.
And that's okay, and that's part of the leave no stone unturned. You want to show that you really have reliable results, because you tried it this way, you tried it that way, you tried it another way.
I was once working with a graduate student, and this person was working very diligently on a quantitative piece, and was doing the regression analysis, and I kept seeing, the regression models are all really small in terms of the number of predictor variables. And I said to this person, we've talked about all the literature and all the different variables that represent these different arguments, why aren't they there? This person said, well, I tried them and they didn't work, so I just didn't include them. We want to know what doesn't work too when you're doing the analysis. But yeah, that was a major turning point. The person went on and was very successful. It's like, no, you have a full model that represents the various arguments, the competing hypotheses that you're testing in, and you let us see what works and what doesn't. You don't just sort of hide it.
As for kind of like having to be very practical as graduate students and thinking job market and all that kind of stuff, some of the things that come to my mind are like the number of publications, the impact scores that you guys talked about. But one of the things that I was curious about is types of journals. So if you're, going out in the market for one thing, but you have expertise in two areas of sociology, or if you can be in a health and a crime journal, I mean, should you really be focusing on one area, or is it better to diversify, basically? And this is for everybody.
You need to be able to tell the story of your research and have it make sense to a reader. And so if you get a piece in criminology, but you also get a piece in Journal of Health and Social Behavior, because your work is at the intersection, most readers, I think, would say, oh, look at, yeah, he's talking to different audiences. And a lot of it depends upon the paper. So one paper may not fit as well, something like criminology, but fit much better some other journal. And I think most people would take that into consideration.
Yeah, I'm thinking about you in particular, because I think I have an idea as to why you're asking that question. First thing, publications are good, all right? And if they're in different areas, that can either mean the person is a dabbler, or the person just has a variety of interests. So that's what I see as key, is just to be able to say, and this often this happens most times after the fact. So you're completing, you have a culture article, you have a crime article, and you have a health article, and they're not connected substantively, but you come up with a story and say, well, they're connected for me because of the following reasons. So I got hired here doing railroads in the record industry.
He was hired as a comparative
Yeah.
historical sociologist.
So you wouldn't think that the record and the railroad industry are anything connected at all, but actually there are theoretical and methodological things that connect me. But you just need the story. Do you know the story right now? Well, oftentimes not, but it emerges. That's where I'm qualitative when you're talking about your own work. Your identity is emergent more than you can decide it at the beginning and say, this is who I am, and the narrative is fixed, because what you publish over time can change. So, does that make sense? Yeah.
So
But in the end, if you have multiple publications, it doesn't hurt.
a quick follow-up to Dan's question is, I know that publishing in any journal is not easy, but at some point, is it more important, I know that we want to get a generalist journal if possible, but at some point you want to go on with a published something. At that point, is it okay to just aim for third tier, or should we always be trying to aim for one step higher and risk the month, like the 1.5 long review process for a paper?
That's standard.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think anybody ever realizes. I don't realize that I've already done this. Like,
So it's long regardless. And
It's long regardless.
Anywhere. But
Anywhere.
should that factor into our decisions as to where we send it?
Well, I would also encourage you not to think of generalist versus specialist. It's top tier generalist and specialist.
I mean, like third, like maybe journals that you guys haven't even heard of, but it's still published. you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. So there are, so in our department, for instance, you know, when we're evaluating people, we like, you know, the generalist journals that make everyone go like, wow, or, you know, ASR, AJS, but also, you know, if you're a social psychologist and you get an SPQ, that's the top specialist, so that's good. But you're asking about, what happens is that, you have to just strategize about, there are some papers that you go like, this is the one that I think can really go for ASR, I'm gonna put this one there. But some of them, you know, that, you know, it's probably, it's good, but it's you know, it's not the, what is their rejection rate, 8% or acceptance? 5%, yeah. Their acceptance rate is 5%, so you know you got to be really cutting edge and innovative and important to get into there. And not everyone is, and not every article is. It'd be very difficult. So, you know, if you go to a sociological forum, for instance, after you know, with some pieces, it's a very good journal that will help you. But it's not the same tier as ASR, and the people at Sociological Forum know that.
And your advisor can help too in terms of, you know, where you might send it. And again, like, well, it's, you know, a 1.5-year process. If you have a paper ready to send out, you're going to send to a top journal. Often you'll get the reviews back like within 3 months or less. So if you think there's some chance and there's no like pressing reason to have that, you're not like going on the job market in the next, you know, month or so, you know, take the shot. But your advisor or the others may tell you, well, probably not ASR, but. Well, I want to thank the presenters again for a great job, and this will be posted on the Blackboard site. I'll make copies of the handouts available sometime early next week, and if you have any other questions, of course, everyone is around to address them. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Good luck.